road again, which may remind you of Willie Nelson, which is why I did that. But that has nothing to do with anything. And yeah, so this passage is actually one on discipleship. So I have from time to time been told by people that I should probably do a series of sermons on discipleship. And I've always been a little bit offended by that, because well, what do I do every week? That's what we do, right, Dave? So, every sermon really is about discipleship. So we're seeking to learn how to be like Jesus, how to follow Jesus, how to understand Jesus, how to know God, how to know his ways and all that kind of stuff. So that's all discipleship. That's all really we're doing, and that's what we're about. However, that being said, this particular passage today is a little bit more potent in terms of discipleship. It kind of, I was looking for a word in Inglesby this morning, and I said, what is it? And somebody said, acute. Yes, it's acute. It's acute discipleship talk. And that's a little rough. But some of the resources that I was looking into kind of preparing for this said, you just can't sugarcoat this stuff. Jesus said it, this is the way it is. And so there it is. So here's the background. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. So what we're being told by the gospel writer Luke is that Jesus is heading for the last time on the road to Jerusalem. Yeah, well, let's leave that up for a while. So this is the road to Jerusalem, and it was one that Jesus took a lot. So he was back and forth on that road. Probably went up to the feasts, which were several times a year, but probably 3 times a year the men were required to go to Jerusalem. And so Jesus was pretty rigorous about doing that, going like the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Pentecost and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover and all those feasts. So that was a common Jewish thing for the Jews to do. Now the Jews that lived up in Galilee, they had a little bit of a trip. So the road to Jerusalem, if you walk it, it's about like, I think, walking from here to Peterborough and then back again. So you guys, do you walk to Peterborough very often? Not very much. So you got to give or allow for 4 or 5 days to get there, and the same for coming back. So there's a big chunk of time, and then the days of the feast. So it's a fairly big undertaking every time the gospel says, and so they went up to Jerusalem. You think, oh, they went to, they went over to the high school. It's not like that. They had a big trip, a big journey. But this is the last time Jesus is going to do this trip. So this is the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven. So Jesus knows what is going to befall him. He knows he will die, and he knows he will rise, and subsequently he will ascend into heaven. He's going back home again, which is an interesting way to put it. It says, the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven. Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. So he set out with a determined stride, with great, I think the King James Version has got it maybe a little bit more accurately. He set his face like flint. So he hardened his features almost, because it's not an easy thing to do, what he's doing. He's going to where he knows he's going to get killed. But it's out of love, it's out of obedience, and it's just why he came in the first place. So he's heading down that road. So you might imagine that in the conversations that he has with people, that might kind of weigh in, the whole idea of heading for the cross. And if you remember some of the other discipleship sayings that Jesus says, there are things like, if anyone would come after me or be my disciple, he must take up his cross daily and follow me, which doesn't, sound like an easy thing either. So that's kind of the setting for what's happening. So it says he sent messengers on ahead and went into a Samaritan village, to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. So here's the picture. Jesus would like to take the red route, number one, because that's on the west side of the Jordan. It's more straightforward, and it gets you there a little bit quicker. When you're walking all that way, it's like when you're walking to Peterborough, would you like to walk by Aurelia, or would you like to just go straight there? The problem is it's got Samaria in the middle. Now the Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. In fact, they didn't even talk to each other, basically. Hated each other, by and large. So we have a number of interesting stories in the Gospels where Jesus engages the Samaritans. So this is another one of those places where he just leaves all the cultural taboos aside, and he treats them like everybody else. But they won't. When they hear he's going to Jerusalem, they particularly hate Jerusalem. They're not going to let him go through. I also like this map because if you've been here the last few weeks, we've had a number of lessons and sermons around the sites up in Galilee, like Capernaum. Was the beginning of the last chapter where Jesus met with, that's at the top of the lake. Oh yeah, the little lake at the top is the Sea of Galilee. Can you read that? Okay. And the big lake at the bottom is the Dead Sea. The river flows, the Jordan River flows from Galilee down to the Dead Sea. So the Sea of Galilee up the top, the northwest corner is Capernaum, where he meets with and heals the servant of a Roman centurion. Over on this side, you see Gadara in the Decapolis. That's Gentile country. That's where he cast out a whole legion of demons into a herd of pigs, right? And they all tore down the hillside and drowned in the lake. And that's an interesting story because they asked Jesus to leave town, and he does leave town. He just leaves. We talked about that last week. There's Nain just at the beginning of the red line. Nain was where he raised the son of the widow. So basically, he's probably forced them to cross the Jordan and go down and take the blue route. So that's just to get you kind of geographically oriented as well. So Jesus is on the road, and a big chunk of the Gospel of Luke takes place on this road. Like basically the rest of the Gospel, pretty much. Right through to the crucifixion is the theological experts, they call this the travel narrative. And so there are a whole lot of parables that are peculiar to Luke, that he tells them on the way to Jerusalem on this trip. So he's not allowed. So John and James say, now John and James are two of his inner core disciples, right? They're the brothers. Jesus calls them the sons of thunder. I wonder why. Lord, do you want to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? Shall we? They're so eager to help, you see. Now these guys are zealous, and we must commend them for their zeal, really. I mean, they are wholeheartedly into this enterprise, and they're ticked off on Jesus' behalf. So Jesus is not allowed to, and they're just indignant about that, and they figure something should be done about that. It's not all that untoward, the calling down from fire in heaven to destroy people. In fact, that's something that Elijah was known to do. So there's a whole lot of Elijah allusions going on here. So for once, at one point in the Old Testament narrative, Elijah is the king has sent some troops to capture him, and he just calls down fire from heaven, and they're gone. A couple of times actually, and then another time is the very famous battle with the prophets of Baal, where the prophets of Baal have got their sacrifice, and they're cutting themselves and chanting to their gods and all this kind of stuff, and nothing happens. Elijah makes an altar, and I'm actually just getting to that. I haven't got there. I'm jumped ahead. Well, I'll come back. Elijah makes his stone altar. He kills a cow. He puts the last bit of water in the land all over this thing, and then he prays, and there's fire from heaven. It just consumes everything. And the people say, "The Lord, He is God." So it's a big sign to them, and they sort of, at least temporarily, turn back to God. So this is the journey. Jesus has set his face like flint. This is an artist's conception of Jesus heading along that road, and the disciples kind of almost fearfully kind of treading along behind through the cross there in front. Kind of the trail is leading to the cross, which reminded me, there's this parallel between this and discipleship, because discipleship is us heading toward the cross. So we need to take this into account. And this actually comes from that, I have a very simple kid song. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. And the world behind me, see that's the little globe behind him? The world behind me, the cross before me. And that's not an easy thing to do. So you put the world behind you and the cross before you, and you carry on. So the next one is this picture. So there's Elijah calling down fire from heaven. So that's what John and James kind of have in mind to help Jesus out. And they aren't quite getting it, if you can see. So, I mean, Jesus wasn't, even when the Gadarenes, the Gentiles said, "Please leave," he just got up and left. So he always never pushes himself upon anybody. And here's another example of where he does not push himself. He just goes another way. He'll come, they'll hear again. They'll get another opportunity. But what it says is Jesus turned and rebuked them. So John and James got an earful after this little stunt they tried to pull. Even it was good intentioned, And lots of times, so this reminds me of where we get into trouble as Christians. Because if you're a follower of Jesus, a disciple, a Christian, you actually do have some power in your life. That whether or not you realize it, you've got some power in your life. You've got a place in this world. You're part of God's light in this world. It's salt on earth. These guys had a taste of that. His disciples in the 2 chapters before, Jesus had sent them out 2 by 2, and they cast out demons, and they healed the sick, and they preached the gospel, and they had wonderful results. And so the problem is when that sort of thing happens, you can kind of get on your high horse a little bit. Right? And that has happened in the history of the church an awful lot. And that's one of the things I think that turns people off the gospel and off being part of us. Because too often they feel that kind of the wrath being kind of pushed towards them. They didn't listen to us. They didn't give us an ear. They are going straight to hell. Ever heard something like that talked about? Yeah. That's not Jesus' way. And so, but it has been commonly the plague of the Christian faith down through the centuries, where we've got out of hand, we've got overzealous, and we've misrepresented Christ. And so this is part of the discipleship lesson that we have as we walk along this road. It's great to be zealous. May it be well-informed and gentle and full of grace and full of patience and so on. So then we move on. So now Jesus encounters, just look at the middle section for now, because this will kind of bend your brain a little bit. So you can see the 3 guys in the middle circle, and the guy with the orange is Jesus, actually, looking at them. And these are 3 different guys having 3 different responses to kind of the call to be disciples. And they're all a little different. And so this is, some of you remember the Crossways course, and Sheila still does it a little bit. This is some of the Crossways material that was on transparency. So it's too hard to see like this, so we broke it down. So let's get the next one is just the middle chunk. Okay, so there's these 3 guys. Jesus is talking to them. The symbol at the bottom is a wonderful symbol, I think. It's one of the Crossways material, the artist for that brought forward. This is the symbol for Jesus. And he's kneeling down in this position that he took when he washed his smelly old, dirty old disciples' feet, right? Because he knelt down and he scrubbed their feet. What kind of leader is that? It's a servant leader, but he's also the king. He's the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. All power in heaven and earth has been given to me, says Jesus. So he's the humble servant king, which is an amazing paradox. And I think one of the wonderful, most attractive things about Jesus. So he's calling these guys into that life. And they have different stories to tell. So the first story is the one on the far left there. See that guy with the orange hoodie? Whatever, first century hoodie. I just thought of that. That's pretty cool. So he's a little over-eager, this guy. He's like a little bit naively, those guys that, yeah, I can do it. And so that's what he says. He says, I will follow you wherever you go. So Jesus decides to give him a little bit of a reality check. And he says this, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. So probably what this guy has in mind, almost all the first disciples of Jesus had some kind of misconception about what was going on. That this is Messiah. Messiah means rescue from Rome. We're going to be on the inside of some great coup to take over the land and take it back for Israel and for the Jews again. And we're going to be the inside guys, and we're going to, that's going to go pretty well for us because we're going to get, all kinds of possibly wealth and power and homes. And, some of that dream semi-consciously was probably in them. Jesus is going to disabuse him of that. And he says, you know what? Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nothing, basically. He walked through this earth with nothing. I mean, he had places to stay, he had things to eat, but it was all pretty transient. He never was stuck on anywhere. And so there's this guy that's kind of laying there just on the ground. In the background, you see those wealthy kind of edifices and mansions and such. Now, there's another level of meaning in this text, because the words fox and birds of the air were kind of euphemistic for other things. Jesus, for instance, called Herod, King Herod, that fox. And so a fox was someone of kind of mixed race who had kind of infiltrated the land. And so it was I mean, he's the king, basically. So here he's a non-Jew is the king of Judea and Galilee and so forth. So he says, so foxes, he's got his hole, and the birds of the air were the Gentiles, like the Romans. I mean, they've got their nests, they've got their place in the land, but the Son of Man, who is the rightful prince, the rightful heir, the rightful king, he has no place to lay his head. So if you're following me, you better count the cost, because it's not going to be all a bowl of cherries. And it's true today. People need to count the cost if you want to be a follower of Jesus. So it might mean, for instance, okay, it might mean homelessness. It might mean poverty. No saying it won't. It might mean persecution. And in many parts of the world, still today it does, because people have to pay a big price to be a follower of Jesus. You let it be known, you can lose your property, you can lose your house, you can be thrown in jail, and worse, like this. Last one, which is you could suffer or be killed or martyred. I mean, all those things were possible back then. They're possible still today. We live in a relatively safe zone in the world, but even then, that's actually dangerous spiritually, because there's such a draw for us not to avoid all this kind of thing, that we have to really take stock. Are we really ready to be Jesus' disciples? Even if you're never called to any of these things, could you do them? Would you do them? That's a little pause for thought there, isn't it? Could you, would you, might you? Yeah. So, we don't know. The 20th century, I've said this a few times before, the 20th century was the hardest century in all the history since the church began on Christians throughout the world. More martyrs, more suffering, more persecution than at any other time in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ throughout the world. So it's not something that's come to an end by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so the next guy, this one Jesus actually calls him. He said to another man, the first one volunteers. This one, Jesus says, "Follow me," like he did to James and John. But the man replied, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead. You go and proclaim the kingdom of God." He said, "Follow me." But first let me go and bury my father. Now, that seems perfectly legitimate, is it not? I mean, is Jesus not just going way overboard here, really? The guy just wants to go give his dad a funeral. Would that not be the proper thing to do? Except he probably hasn't died yet. That's true. So somebody's been studying their Bible around here. Yeah, probably not. Well, so yeah, you can actually see the tomb in the back and the stone to be rolled away over it. So first century Jewish burial practices, a little bit different than ours. What they would do is they would put the body in the tomb, and they would let it molder, shall we say, for about a year. Then they would go and collect the bones, and they would put them in a little box, which is called an ossuary, I think. Is that the right word? Ossuary? Ossuary. And then they would bury that kind of more permanently in a niche or a hole maybe in the tomb or something like that. So it was kind of a two-part stage thing. So it's possible that when this guy said, "Let me go first bury my father," he means, let me go home till my father dies, and we deal with the estate and stuff, and then hopefully I'll get around to getting back to you on that. I'll get back to you on that, right? That's what this guy's saying. Alternatively, they may have had the burial, and there, it was somewhere in the middle before the final burial of the bones in the ossuary. So whatever the case, basically he's saying, he's putting Jesus off. This isn't a good time. It's not a good time. Maybe later. So I have this next one. So for all you geeks out there, remind me later, Lord. That's not the way discipleship works with Jesus. Jesus gets first call. no matter what the cultural norms are. And Jesus speaks in hyperbole a lot. He puts things in ways to shock us in order to get his point across, and to grab to test our emotions and to test our motivations. So that's what's going on here. Are you ready to follow me? Because it's now. And clearly all through Scripture, it's always now is the time of salvation. Today is the day. Today is the day. That song we sang, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Choose this day whom you shall serve, says Joshua to the people of Israel. Then he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But choose this day. It's not a thing you can put off. This isn't that kind of a thing. It's the first demand on our lives. Okay, what's the next guy? So the next guy, he has a fairly credible thing too. Still another said, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Elisha got to do that. Now, in other churches, we read the story about Elisha starting to follow Elijah. And Elisha goes back and sort of says goodbye to his family, has a little feast, slaughters his oxen, burns them with the plow and stuff. So, and then he feeds them, and then he runs off and follows Elijah. But Jesus says no, basically. He says, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. What's probably going on here is another custom of the ancient world that, well, for starters, both these guys that are kind of reluctant to follow Jesus, they're probably actually doing something that's rather offensive, although we don't realize it. In that day and age, there were a number of groups that were known to have disciples, the Pharisees, the Herodians, different ones. And if you were a renowned rabbi and you said to someone, follow me, it was a huge honor. Like, so when Jesus walked the shores of Galilee and he says to Peter and Andrew and James and John, follow me, and they dropped their nets and they took off and followed him, because they were not going to get a chance like this again. These guys were not the brightest cookies in the barrel, shall we say. Okay? Usually disciples were guys that had memorized the Torah and the Talmud and the Mishra, I don't even know those words. All the Jewish literature. They'd memorized it. They knew it cold. And if you didn't, you probably didn't qualify. So these guys who were Joe fishermen, they wouldn't have had much of an opportunity. So it was a great honor for this renowned rabbi to come along, a miracle worker, a prophet, someone who would raise the dead and say, follow me. Well, maybe later. Or I'm going to go say goodbye to the parents, which means probably means I got to go and ask permission of my father. Because you got to realize, if he follows Jesus, he gives up his livelihood, which normally would be following in the footsteps of his father. And so you can sort of see the natural sense of that. But this is the thing. Following Jesus is not something you ask anybody's permission about. So that's my next one. If you want to achieve discipleship, stop asking for permission. Now, I crossed out the word discipleship, had greatness behind it there. So the saying that's all over the place is, if you want to achieve greatness, stop asking for permission. But we're not really called to achieve greatness. We are called to achieve discipleship. But the same thing applies. It's not a thing of permission. You don't wait for anybody else to give you the go-ahead. It's on you. You decide. I have decided to follow Jesus. Though no one join me, still I will follow. It's on you. And it's between you and him, which is kind of wonderful, terrible thing of it all. But it's not something that you ask permission for. So Jesus said, I don't think it's the way it works. Then he gives him a little parable. He says, which is the last one, second last picture. No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. So you see the guy looking back. He's not doing a great job of plowing. I don't know if you can notice the furrows are all over the map, and the cow doesn't know who's boss here. How many of you have plowed? I haven't. You plowed? Really? Yeah, well, man, of course. Tractor, horses? Tractor. Anybody with oxen? You've done with oxen? Awesome. I'm pretty sure you're the only one in all three churches that ever plowed with oxen. But that's what Jesus is talking about, plowing with oxen. Now I'm going to get in trouble because I'm going to pretend I know something about it, which I don't. But apparently, you can correct me afterwards. You kind of have to have one hand on the plow, guiding the plow, and the other hand either kind of on the oxen, guiding that oxen with a little switch or something to keep it going where you want it to go. It's a full-time occupation. It doesn't take much for that thing to want. Can you imagine what happens if you're doing that and you're looking behind? You're going to be all over the map, and you're going to wreck the furrows, wreck the job, and wreck the field. So everybody in Jesus' day knew this stuff. Eyes straight ahead, full concentration, full focus on the job, or you're going to muck it all up. And basically that's what discipleship is like. It requires your whole self. It requires your whole focus. It requires a lot of discipline, hence the word discipline and discipleship, right? I mean, it's a life of meditation, of self-examination, of confession, of prayer, of scripture study, of worship, of gathering with God's people, of changing the world around you for good. I mean, it's a high calling. You can't be back and forth with it, hot or cold, So that's what Jesus is kind of saying. So last slide is simply this. Are you ready to put your hand to the plow? Shall we pray?